What is art?
Art is
history.
What is art? That's a good question.
This is Art Uncovered.
Art is our collective cultural history.
A weekly podcast that brings you interviews with an eclectic mix of artists and creators.
Art is
disappointing your parents.
I'm your host, Kimberly. Happy Tuesday, everyone. Thanks for tuning in to this week's episode of Art Uncovered. This week, I spoke with Sam Dienst, a tapestry weaver and sculptor currently living and working in Detroit. Sam graduated in 2016 with a BFA in Fibers from Mass Art and an MFA in Fibers from Cranbrook Academy of Art in 2021. Over the course of the conversation, we talk about Sam's path to becoming a weaver, her journey through graduate school, and the tools and techniques she uses to build her style and to sustain her practice. Stay with us. Hello, listeners. Welcome to episode 2 of this 2-episode special focusing on the art of weaving. I'm Kimberly, and this week I'm so excited to be here with Detroit-based artist Sam Dienst. Sam, thanks for joining us.
Hello.
So Sam, I think I mentioned this to you off air that it's such a specialized art form, and I've been running this podcast for almost 15 years, and I've only interviewed 2 weaving artists so far, and hopefully there are more to come, but I'm kind of curious how you found this art form. I read somewhere, I think it was maybe Hyperallergic or something like this, that you found your way via kind of through fashion. Is that true?
To an extent. So as a kid, my mom is a really great seamstress. So I spent a lot of time wandering like through Joann's, picking out fabric. It just felt really possible because I saw my mom doing it. I think most people, if you're like, yeah, you can make your own clothes, would be like, no,
It's
I can't.
Intimidating, yeah.
Most people don't know how to put a button back on a shirt, but it's part of my hand, I understand how fabric folds and how you can kind of manipulate it. So I think that was where I started. So I thought I wanted to be a fashion designer. I feel like as a kid, you're like, you either want to be a painter, a comic book artist, or like you want to make clothes as some of the kind of angles that you understand as maybe a 12-year-old. So I made some of my own clothes and I loved touching and picking out fabric, but I realized later that I'm really not that fashion oriented. I'm a little too pragmatic to actually care about designer brands or any of that stuff. I went for a tour of FIT on my way to college and I was like, oh, I don't want to.
So you knew before you even went to college that fashion wasn't So were you looking for schools that had a weaving program, or?
I knew nothing about weaving until I got to school. So I went to Mass Art, and they're a state art school. So it's actually pretty cool. If you're from New England, you get a different tuition cost. So all that kind of factored in. And then I found the fiber department at Mass Art. And that sort of was just like happenstance. You sign up for an elective. I took an intro to fiber class and I just really liked my professor, Judith Lehman, awesome teacher. And she just had us try a bunch of different stuff. And then I was like, oh, this is the most fun thing like that I took in that kind of foundational year. And so I ended up declaring my major in fiber. But when I was first starting that, I was making a lot of soft sculpture because I was still thinking in that like pattern, like flat thing into sculpture thing that clothing sort of is, where your body kind of makes it 3-dimensional. And it wasn't until junior year that I finally was like, I guess I'll take weaving. Like that was my attitude about it because it seemed so technical. It seemed really rigid. Like you're on this grid system. There's so much where you have to set up. Like none of that was intuitive to me. I'm a very like start cutting things up and figure it out as I go.
Yeah, so how is that transition? Because it is structure based, my understanding.
Absolutely. So in my intro to weaving class, we had like a really short point where we had to weave a circle and we learned tapestry techniques. And that is where I was like, oh, you can make pictures in the weaving. And that's I was like hooked after that. Because the idea of making like repetitive yardage that's just like a pattern, I mean, it's great to know that. And I definitely teach that in my own curriculum. But I also am really emphatic to show everyone how tapestry works because it's such a different mental space to be working in, to be building up in little sections on top of the warp, as opposed to running a shuttle back and forth through all of the threads and kind of making this continuous pattern.
Yeah, can we
You're
talk about
building it up
that?
like line by line.
Yeah, can we talk about that a little bit? So
Yeah.
tapestry is separate, or would you, how does tapestry relate to weaving? So tapestries have like images kind of woven into it?
Yeah, I mean, there's a lot of ways. And also, tapestry can in itself not be pictorial or representational. There's plenty of tapestry in a lot of like cultures where they're doing a lot of geometric shapes, but the actual system is the same as if you were going to weave a figure or if you're going to weave squares and triangles and shapes. So
Okay.
you have your warp on your loom. So you set up the loom exactly
thanks.
the same way.
Look at that.
And I have all these lines going up and down. That's my warp. And then instead of going all the way across those rows, you're just going in little fragmented sections. So there'll be, picture a bunch of vertical lines. We're going underneath little parts of that across horizontal rows. And those are all interconnecting and kind of building up all the shapes.
So brilliant. So this is all by hand.
Yes, no electricity.
That's incredible. I was talking to the artist Poppy Delta Dawn, who was in episode 1 of this series, and she was talking about a digital loom. Do you know anything about these?
Yeah.
Do you have any experience with them?
I think that's why I list myself as handwoven, because there has been a lot of progress. It's not even that new of a technology. Jacquard weaving's been around for a while, where the machine essentially has a predetermined way that it's going to pick up strings and make your pattern. And they've made these looms called TC2 looms now, where you're building a digital file. You're still throwing a shuttle and you're still weaving it, but everything as far as strings going up and down, you're not stepping on foot pedals and things. It's all going to decide digitally what goes up, what goes down. I have used a TC2. I did make one at grad school. And it's fascinating and mind-blowing to just think about how to build the files is like a whole lifetime of exploration.
Yeah. Are those files created digitally?
Yeah, so you're in a Photoshop file and everything.
Oh, interesting.
Everything in weaving is essentially the same idea as the Matrix. So computers are actually based on looms. Everything's either going under a string or over a string. No matter what you're doing, whether you're doing tapestry or any other kind of weaving, you're going over or under. Okay. And those like repetitions of going under multiple strings and then over multiple eventually gives you this pattern. So the ones and zeros of the computer is the same concept. It's either like a yes or a no.
Wow, brilliant. Now, one thing that Poppy mentioned was like the kind of the efficiency of these digital looms, right? Is it quicker to produce final objects or final tapestries on the digital versus handwoven?
Yes. I mean, so how fast you weave is partially just your own energeticness. Some people are very, very deliberate and they're making very perfect kind of things. The Jacquard loom definitely lets you be more complicated. You essentially, just again with computers, the way I explain how weaving works, and especially tapestry, is that it kind of works like a Photoshop file as far as pixels, because everything's a grid. So you have all these vertical rows on a Photoshop file and then horizontal, and that makes this grid system.
Sure.
So when you zoom super close in, you're getting these like jagged edges of cubes that are pixels. So even when you zoom, even a really high definition photo, if you get close enough,
it's all squares.
There's no real curved line. Everything's actually up or over, up or over, up or over.
Brilliant.
And so I just have a certain resolution, if you will, DPI in Photoshop terms, that I'm working within. So if I want something to look like it's curving, I'm going up, over, and I'm going up steeper and over longer, depending on how I want that shape to eventually kind of land, like from a viewer perspective.
Yeah, and I'm wildly curious about the labor involved here. So how large? I'm looking at listeners. If you're listening to this episode on Spotify or anything like this, I encourage you to take a look at our YouTube so that you could actually see Sam's studio and the loom in the background. There's wildly fascinating. But I see a weaving. Or if you want to correct me, I'm not sure if you would consider it a weaving or a tapestry behind you. I'm curious of the size of your works and maybe how long it takes you to produce one with this, all hand woven.
Yeah, absolutely. So a weaving is, or a tapestry rather, is a weaving. Not all weaving is tapestry. It's just kind of like
that. Okay.
Squares and rectangles.
Yep.
All squares are rectangles. Not every rectangle is a square.
Yep.
This is a tapestry. It's also very much a weaving. And when you're weaving on a loom, you have a certain width that the machine physically is. So mine is 60 inches wide. So
wow, that's big.
I'm always kind of plotting out my compositions, knowing that I have 60 inches in one direction. I can split that in half. So I can make two 30-inch things side by side if I want to, or any combination, of course. Right now, this one I'm using the full width. So it's going to be 60 inches across. And then your warp can be as long as you want in theory. I mean, there's probably a limit of hundreds of yards eventually where you'd have to start another piece. But this one I think is going to be about 60 by 60.
Wow.
So it's going to be a really big piece that I'm working on.
Yeah, wow.
The biggest piece I've ever made, I think, was 60 by like 80 or so in inches.
Did you tally like the amount of hours it took to make this one?
I mean, I can guess, and it also depends, the philosophical side of like, how long did it take? Well, how long have you been working as an artist? All of those years build up, and those kinds of silly stipulations. But I would say I started this piece probably a couple of weeks ago, and it'll probably still have another 2 weeks on it. So I'd say it's going to take me approximately a month to do the physical weaving of everything.
Yeah.
But before I weave, I'm designing a drawing. So there's what's called a cartoon. It's a piece of paper that's hanging. That's literally 1-to-1 size. So I have a 60 by 60 sheet of paper with line drawings on it. And they're just line drawings in my case. People make cartoons with all kinds of complexity depending on their system, but I don't pick any of my colors in advance. So I'm kind of responding as I go. I'll pick a bunch of colors, start weaving, and then I'm like, okay, I used a lot of red in this lower half. Let's bring in some cold colors to kind of balance out. And I'm always kind of thinking about
so fun.
Having a variety of values and colors throughout the piece.
Yeah, it sounds like you're approaching that kind of from a painterly or as a painter. I'm curious, do you have any background in painting?
I think, like I said, with fashion being the first way that I touched fabric, like I think a lot of young creative people have some relationship to drawing and painting. So it's just kind of the most obvious supplies that you find access to. So I love to draw. I love to paint. Like I love those things. But there was something that clicked between I used to draw and paint a lot. I found tapestry. And it was sort of this beautiful merge between touching all the fabric and that kind of tactile world. So I loved to draw, and I realized that you could draw in fabric, and that was sort of an epiphany point with falling in love with tapestry. So there's a ton of, I look at a lot of painting. I like to look at drawing. I like to look at textile work, and there's so much overlap, especially these days, between any medium and practice.
Brilliant.
So part of what I think defines my own style is that I do a lot of outline work. So a lot of the shapes will have a second color that's kind of showing you the edges of different shapes as they kind of crisscross and overlap. And that's not a super conventional tapestry thing. Usually you're kind of blending colors together, but I have these kind of starker outlines around a lot of shapes.
I'm going to actually do a screen share so we could take a look at some of what you're talking about. Okay, can you see my screen here?
Yeah, absolutely.
Okay, excellent. So are like this black line where my mouse is kind of hovering over?
Yes.
Is this what you're referring to? Yeah, it feels quite like illustrative.
Yeah. I want them to still feel like the drawings that were the source kind of cartoon shape. So that piece
Cool.
that's on the screen started as just a black and white line drawing. That's actually two images. So it's a picture of all the dishes in my sink overlapped with a bouquet of flowers. So you can
Oh
kind
my
of start to
God,
see
brilliant. I'm gonna zoom in.
flowers overlapping glassware and plates and things, or at least I
Brilliant.
can.
I can too.
Um, and so all those lines are just there, and it's just black and white drawing, and then that slowly gets fleshed out and sort of solidified as I go up through weaving it.
Amazing. I'll try to, oh, I guess that's as far as I could zoom in. I'm wondering if you could chat a little bit more about your subject matter. So, this particular tapestry that we're looking at was a reference to all the dishes in your sink. I'm going to scroll down here, and your next one. I also see some kitchen food
Yeah,
symbols here. Like, I don't know if that's an ice
that
tray, banana, maybe.
absolutely. So that's
Yeah.
the inside of my freezer, actually. So it is an ice tray. Those
Ah,
are some bananas that are like super brown that have been in my freezer for like way too long.
yeah,
There's a
brilliant.
bottle of gin right there that has that little green drip coming out of it. There's a bunch of frozen fruit bags in the top there. All those kind of amorphous shapes are actually like the bags in the freezer.
Now,
Yeah.
so your work starts as drawings. So is it like observational, I guess,
Yeah.
quote unquote, observational drawings that are then translated into thread?
Yeah. So I go between. So sometimes I am just kind of sitting and almost drawing a still life. And then some stuff is sort of from my imagination where it's sort of a ubiquitous object. Like in that piece you're scrolling past right now, there's a light bulb up at the top.
Yeah.
That's actually sewn on later, but the imagery is still like it's a light bulb, but it's sort of a cartoon light bulb almost. So some of the images are just the concept of a thing as opposed it's almost like clip art energy as opposed to like straight from life image. And then some stuff is photographs. So I'm constantly in my kitchen like cutting up lemons, and I just really like the shape that the lemon is. There's something kind of bodily but also something just really comfortable about domestic banal subject matter that I like to kind of take all of those things. So usually I'm collecting a bunch of photos, doing little drawings, kind of and then I take all of those images into the computer. So this is the only place where digital really is a big part of how I'm working, where I'll take a photo and I'll trace out like the line work that I want from it, get a line drawing, and then all of those line drawings eventually get collaged together into one big composition. So there's like a bunch of moments kind of being collaged together to get that drawing that is the basis for the weaving.
I can imagine that the conceptualizing and drawing stage is, if not like as long, maybe even longer than how long it takes to actually do the weaving.
Yeah, I'll go through phases where I'm like really into drawing. I'm spending a little more time just like collecting imagery and all of those things. And then maybe I'll spend like a week or two where I'm really shuffling around the drawings. The nice thing about the computer is I can take an image that's pretty small and I can blow that up so the scale of any given object is not really in relation to the other objects in there. Something might be a slice of lemon might be the same size as my whole body in the final composition. But yeah, a lot of the stuff is basically just my stuff. So domestic objects, cups, lamps, dishes, and then also sort of like a lot of food, a lot of I think a lot about like the rituals of my life. Like if I'm eating the certain food all the time, like it'll probably find its way in there, different routines. We don't have a dishwasher, so having to put on dish gloves and do my dishes is like a pretty daily activity. And so like dish gloves and like pots and pans will find their way in often because it's just something that is recurring in my life that I'm sort of have a love-hate relationship with dealing with. And so those things kind of end up all compiling together.
Do you see any like symbolism or references to women's work? Because you mentioned like cleaning the dishes and domestic objects, and how,
Yeah.
weaving is seen by some, or maybe even like seamstresses or fabric seams, as this like feminine form. Is that anything that you're conscious of?
I'm definitely conscious of it. I mean, it's kind of hard to not think about being a woman, or just, your own identity and your own kind of things folding in.
Yeah.
I'm not so much trying to reference super deeply like women's work culture, but I think that by choosing textiles, you're kind of inevitably thrown into that conversation, and you should have, a good acceptance of it, and also to be able to challenge it. I will also say my partner does the dishes just as often as I do, so I give him some credit. But there is something about, I think, just being drawn to domestic spaces. I like my house. I like to host people. I like to have friends over and all that stuff. So I love to cook. So food just becomes something that I have a romantic relationship to. And so it finds its way sort of into the work. But there's also a lot of weird, whimsical stuff that's, like I said, not 100% anything. There's a lot of kind of amorphous, strange shapes and objects. I'm a really big fan of ambiguity. So I like when something can feel like a figure, and also it's maybe just a cup on the table. Like I want the work to give you a chance to kind of, as a viewer, find your own story. I don't need everyone to know like what every single component in the image at the end is. Some stuff's a little more literal, some stuff's a little bit more chaotically mismatched and a little more fantastical.
Were you ever the type of weaver that like, did you start off just kind of making yardage, and then you eventually found your way to pictorial images?
Yeah, I would say I was never a big fan of just the yardage. I definitely made a few projects that way because it's just sort of it's a good way to understand the loom. You do have to spend some time getting used to just how tight should the strings feel. Like there's a lot of just technical proficiency stuff. But I would say I jumped into tapestry pretty fast, but the representation and sort of the pre-planning was sort of a next layer. So when I first fell in love with what was possible, I was just kind of riffing the whole time. Like you don't have to have a plan in order to keep building up these shapes in the work. So I would just, build out a funny blobby kind of shape and then respond to the form around it, because everything kind of has to fit together like a jigsaw puzzle in the surface. So there was a lot of just fantastical, sort of abstract, but I was always still kind of pulling, a window shape, a plant that's nearby, like those kinds of forms will find their way in there. And then it wasn't until I got to grad school that I really decided to give cartoons a try. Again, I don't like a lot of structure, which is counterintuitive again to the loom idea, but I like to be able to have spontaneous moments. So I was avoiding the cartoon, but it's actually really liberated me because now I have a plan. I have that line drawing in the background, and I can focus all the more on colors coming together and all of that, like elements and principle stuff that I think the work is equally about color, shape, texture as it is about whatever the subject matter actually is.
It is. It's beautifully integrated. Where'd you go to graduate school?
I went to Cranbrook Academy of Art, which is here in Michigan. It's probably like 30, 40 minutes north of the city.
Okay. And do they have a textiles program?
Yep, they have a fiber program there,
That's cool.
which is a pretty broad program. There's people that also wove while I was there, but there were also people that didn't know how to weave. Like it's not a super technically forward space. It's very open-ended, as I think a lot of grad programs at this point, people try all kinds of stuff and kind of blend materials together. But I really focused just on really honing my tapestry and really figuring out like, what do I enjoy about this? You're alone in your studio 8 hours a day, most days. So I've really worked to find a way to make what I want to make and enjoy doing it. Because, if you're not enjoying most of the time you're in your studio, like maybe you're not working the way you actually want to. Like I could tape things off and I could get really precise, but I think I would be miserable doing that. I like to keep things a little bit loose. And the tapestry weaving structure kind of forces me, I can't get so loose. There's sort of this rigid grid that lives underneath, but I like pushing against that.
When you applied to graduate school, do you think I hate to use the word goal, but like, was your intent to become a better weaver, or was it to find a style, or like what was your motivation for going to graduate school?
Yeah, I think there's a lot of like different layers. Part of it was I went to undergrad, graduated in 2016, and then started grad school in 2019. So there's sort of 3 years between that where I was just waitressing to pay my bills and then weaving in all of my off time. I never stopped weaving between undergrad. I bought a loom like immediately after I finished school because I knew if I didn't have access to a loom, it'd be very easy to kind of drift away from the medium. You kind of need the machine to be working.
Sure.
So I wanted one, obviously, to just get better at tapestry. You just get more and more kind of intuitive about this should go here and that should go like that, and that's going to make it more stable and all of those kinds of layers. But I also just wanted to have a conversation about the work. No one at my restaurant that I'm working at wants to have me talk about elements and principles and what do I think about color and color theory or any of those layers. So I think I was also looking for a community. I didn't really know what the step between getting a bachelor's degree in fine art and actually having some kind of career looked like. I think I needed to find peers who were also kind of angling for that. And then I would tell my family that I was going to get a master's degree so that I could teach, which isn't untrue. And I do teach now as an adjunct professor, but that was never really the goal. Like, I want to be an artist. I want to have exhibitions. I want to share my work, sell my work, talk about it, and just like be generally a part of that world. And teaching, of course, plays into that, and showing people how to weave tapestry only fortifies my own kind of possibilities of what that can look like.
That's great. And how are you doing with because you graduated in what, 2019, you said, or that's when
I graduated grad school in 21. So it's been 3 years.
Okay. And how have you been exhibiting, showing, selling, all the things?
Yeah. I mean, I teach adjunct, but that's my only like job, if you will, beyond the studio. So I've managed to sort of scrap it together, eat a lot of ramen and those kinds of, there's definitely some financial limitations to trying to be a full-time artist. But no, I'm very grateful and excited that I've had the chance to be in lots of different shows. I just sent some work to 2 different fiber shows that are happening in Ohio and in Colorado.
Oh, that's great.
I had a solo show in January at a gallery in New Jersey. So that was really exciting, and sold some of the work there. So that felt like it's really reassuring to work for like 9 months on an exhibition and then you actually do sell some of the work and you feel a little less crazy about what you've been doing by yourself for so long.
Yeah. Here. And what are you working on now? Do you have any upcoming shows? Or I see the work in progress in your background there of our Zoom meeting.
Yeah. I'm always weaving and I like to just be working. Part of that is, so I don't have anything specifically planned upcoming, but the nature of how long the work takes. So even after I finish weaving it, I go back in and I embellish it. So I'm sewing, embroidering, putting beads, paint, I have a whole second layer that we can get into, but the work takes a little while to make. And so I'm just always working, because should someone hit me up and say, hey, I want to have a show, we want to fill a room, like I kind of have to already be working. Otherwise I have to tell them that I need like a year and a half. And so it helps to just kind of have inventory and have that stuff ready to go.
Yeah, that's great.
But I have lately, since I completed the solo show in January, kind of put it in my head that I am working on a show, even when I'm not working on a show. So that means that I'm making maybe a series of cartoons that I think have some kind of relationship to them. My color is so intuitive that I think the color and like the way that I'm weaving kind of unifies all the work anyway, but I'm essentially just making a body of work that when someone wants it, it'll be ready to go.
So smart. Yeah, I'm curious if you could chat a little bit more about this second layer that you embellish with beads and paint.
Yeah. So part of being in school, there's this kind of, I don't know if people have heard the phrasing of like a painter's painter, but it's like a painter who's like very specific about the kind of paint they use, and they're sort of referencing the canon, and it's sort of inside baseball type of thing. And someone asked me once if I was a weaver's weaver, and I don't really think that I am. I'm not like on the technical, like how complicated can we make the actual structure of the fabric. I'm much more interested in that sort of painting, 2D composition just at large. But I was very hesitant to add things because it sort of felt like I was hurting the purity. Like you spend so long weaving all these shapes, so to put something over the top of parts of it felt like now you can't see the weaving.
Yeah,
but I actually found it really exciting when I first started just embroidering in little sections, and I'm using the same kind of yarn that I'm weaving with to embroider. So it's not like tiny embroidery thread. It'll be big chunky yarn that I'm doing stitches with and kind of adding. I'll re-emphasize those kind of edge lines, and I'll add new shapes and new kind of forms in there. And then once I really was like, okay, I can embroider all over this, that's totally fine. like with my own integrity point or something, like it's all neurotic decisions. I was like, okay, well, if I'm willing to embroider on it, then why not sew some felt down? I used a lot of felt when I was making soft sculpture in my earlier years. So felt is one of my favorite fabrics, probably because you don't have to hem the edges. You can just cut felt and it's sort of stable in and of itself. So it makes great like patchwork applique forms. So there's a lot of felt stitched on. From there, I started adding beads. I got a lot of beads from my grandmother, who has an extensive collection. So I started having access to those, and kind of those found their way on the surface. And then paint was sort of just the final step of, there's no
paint's
hierarchy.
Gotta be scary.
Yeah, paint was scary because you can't get it off. You can cut an embroidery string.
Exactly.
If you make a bunch of stitches and you don't want them, you can cut them off.
Yeah.
But I think I finally reached a point where I had made enough weavings that I was a little less precious from piece to piece, where if I made a piece and I put paint all over it and I hated it, it was going to be fine. Like you can make another weaving. Like you can always make another painting. You can
That's
always
so brave.
something else.
Brave. Oh.
So yeah, that's kind of the second layer. So I'll weave the whole cartoon, and I have a pretty complicated, the canvas is also already the image because the weaving itself is the fabric. And then I'm just going back in and kind of laying things out. I'll cut out little shapes with paper and things. If I'm planning to paint a big section, I'll kind of do things that are less permanent to make sure that compositionally it feels good to put a big circle in a spot or something like that. And I also use paint to add patterns. So I'll put like polka dots. And then when I'm painting, I'll usually go back in and embroider around the shape of the paint, if that makes sense. So I want, when you're looking at the work, especially in just like kind of an image or from across the room, that you can't tell what was woven and what was added later until you get in close, and then you can see, oh, this is paint texture and this is embroidery and this is felt.
Well, Sam, thank you so much for sharing your work and your practice with us. I'm such a big fan. I can't wait to see your work in person.
Yes.
So listeners, I'll make sure to include a link to Sam's website, but also her Instagram page, where hopefully you'll keep us updated on exhibitions and things like this. So yeah, click away, listeners. Make sure to follow, support. Sam, thank you again so much.
Thanks so much. Absolutely.
All right, listeners, that's all for this week. Please be sure to tune in next week, as I will be speaking with Zach Clark, an artist educator and founder of National Monument Press, a publishing house that focuses on small edition artist books, zines, and printed matter, which are all completed largely through collaboration with artists. Hope to see y'all then. Have a safe week. Bye-bye.